We turn now to the rise of British blues. The British blues scene really is a very local kind of thing and localized to London and what was happening there. Now there were also other blues kinds of scenes happening around northern England and places like that, but really the intense activity was happening in London, and really unless you came to London and actually physically saw some of these performances in some of these venues we were talking about, like the Ealing Club and the Marquee, you wouldn't have even known it was happening. This interest on the part of British musicians, mostly middle-aged men, in traditional American music, especially music associated with African American and rural, also rural American cultures, is an interesting kind of phenomenon. Who knows sociologically exactly why it unfolded the way it did? Maybe there's a certain sense that America stands for freedom and stands for opportunity, and British culture was at that time awfully stratified, and without the proper education you really couldn't move up the ladder, and America seemed so much freer from the kinds of traditions and institutions that maybe sort of people felt like in Britain held them back. Who knows? But anyway, there was a very strong interest in some of these styles, blues being one of them, but blues really was one of a few that people were interested. Maybe the most interesting and the earliest one after the Second World War is an interest in traditional jazz. They would call it trad jazz, but we would call it Dixieland. That is the Dixieland music coming out of New Orleans, clarinets, banjos, this kind of thing, trombones. And so there were a number of artists who sort of made their mark by imitating the trad jazz sound, also some of the swing band, big band stuff as well. So people like Acker Bilk, Kenny Ball, and Chris Barber, often called by pop historians the three Bs of the trad jazz revival. These guys were all very active in pushing traditional jazz. Again, with the sense that the American jazz out of New Orleans was the real thing, and they were doing their best to revive it and bring it to Britain. There was also another movement that came out of this called skiffle, most probably best represented by Lonnie Donegan and his big hit, The Rock Island Line, which was not only a hit in Britain in the mid-50s, but also was a hit record in the United States before the folk revival that brought us the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary and people like that at the end of the 1950s and early 60s, so it anticipates that. Skiffle was kind of an upbeat version of folk music, and people who were interested in trad jazz and skiffle really tried to do their research, but the records that they needed, the recordings, were not very available, and so there were very few who had the resources to actually go to America and hear the real thing or buy recordings from American shops. Sometimes you would buy them via mail order, and sometimes you'd go to places like libraries or the American Embassy or places like that and be able to listen to some of these recordings. But it was a bit of a kind of a scavenger hunt to find this music and put it together and do the original thing. Lonnie Donegan, as a skiffle artist, was a great student of American folk music, and again, Bilk, Ball, and Barber, all big students of trad jazz and folk as well. In the 1950s, acoustic or country blues was really big in the UK, but as the 50s transitioned into the 60s, there was a real rise in interest in electric blues based on the Chicago blues scene. And there were a few artists that came through that kind of helped Britain's people in Britain get a sense of how this music sounded live. Josh White would tour the UK. Big Bill Broonzy is mentioned an awful lot by people. Also, Lonnie Johnson. One of the reasons why they didn't see more artists in the UK is because the British Musicians Union had a kind of a deal where they kind of kept Americans from coming in to do too much live work unless they would give a gig, a reciprocal gig to a British musician to come to the US. And so one of the reasons for that was a kind of a protectionism in terms of trying to keep Americans from stealing work or taking work away from British musicians. But what it meant was that there was not a lot of access to live performance of American artists. But somehow Josh White Big Bill Brunzi and Lonnie Johnson all figured out a way around that. As I said earlier video, Alexis Korner, Cyril Davies, a very important force forming this group called Blues Incorporated, often using a guy by the name of Long John Baldry on lead vocals. This group was very influential on the 60s and into the 70s rock scene for musicians coming out of London. The people who circulated in and out of this scene read like a kind of a who's who of British rock of the 60s. We have, of course, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Charlie Watts played with the Blues Incorporated for a short period of time, Jack Bruce, Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, Paul Jones, Eric Burton, John Mayall, Jimmy Page, and even John Paul Jones were sort of on the periphery of this scene for a while. All of this kind of happening around these club evenings on Sundays and Thursdays, where there weren't tons of people in the club at first, but these musicians very interested in this music. There was a real part of what made this scene work was a real embrace of authenticity and a rejection of commercialism and the softening of rock. So what had happened in the British rock and roll scene is in the period between about 56 and 59, the rock and roll had been kind of rowdy the way that American rock and roll was. Of course, the American rock and roll was playing on the charts there as well, but there were British artists who were imitating, like Tommy Steele, Cliff Richard, people like that. But as the 50s transitioned into the 60s, the British pop or rock sound softened, not unlike the American pop sound softened as we started getting into the Brill Building era of the early 60s and the girl groups and the teen idols and Sweet Soul and things like that. Well, a similar kind of thing was happening, and this was seen as a real kind of a commercialization of the music, taking away all of its vital force and kind of homogenizing it to make it polite. And so what blues offered, especially electric blues, was something a little bit more direct, something a little bit more visceral, and in so doing a little bit more honest and well, authentic. And so there was a real kind of attraction there, and that's a lot of what attracted the Rolling Stones to this music, especially Brian, Keith, and Mick. An important document, an important album, if you have a chance to listen to it, is called Blues Incorporated, R&B at the Marquee. It is probably the first UK electric blues record released. The significance of that is that blues records were hard to come by in the UK. So if you had that one that was made and distributed locally, that is in London, it was much more available to people who wanted to hear what this music sounded like. The album R&B at the Marquee was recorded in June of 1962 and released in November of 62. Alexis Korner initially thought of this as being kind of a business card. We'll make an album, we'll get it out on Decca, and then we'll circulate the album around and maybe get some more gigs, Instead of doing auditions, we can send the record around. He actually ended up using a few different backing musicians from the usual band. He wanted this to be as solid and tight as it could be. Interestingly, the songs mix cover versions of Chicago electric blues tunes and traditional blues things with originals. You wouldn't think that a group that is dedicated to Chicago electric blues would have their own original tunes, but they did. They also really play in the electric blues style, but they're not slavish imitators. So the rule of thumb seemed to be when they would do a number that Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf or somebody like that had done, they would do it in the style of that person, and it could be. They gave themselves enough license to say it could be a performance that person could have done, but it doesn't have to be the particular one on the record. So unlike a tribute band, say, that tries to match every single note in nuance, they allowed themselves a little bit more flexibility, and that gave the scene a kind of a vitality that it might not have had otherwise. So not slavish imitators, but they play in the style. Now, Alexis Korner favored a more improvisatory approach to blues. The idea of stretching the tunes with improv and this kind of thing, and of course John Mayall would pick up on that. The Yardbirds, of course, would pick up on that, and he'd be a big influence that way. Cyril Davies, on the other hand, preferred a more traditional approach to the music. And so there were kind of differences and clashes between Alexis Korner and Cyril Davies. And so they ended up splitting. Cyril Davies formed a group called the Cyril Davies All-Stars. He recorded for Pi Records, one of the big independents in the UK, and unfortunately died in January of 1964. If you were going to think about somebody who's really the kind of father figure of the British blues in the early 1960s, it would have to be Alexis Korner, who was a guy that, as I said before, older than some of the rest of the guys, a sophisticated fellow who had his own apartment and stereo system and all these records that nobody else had. And he really was the guy who guided this initial British blues scene. Well, in the crowd, participating, even Mick Jagger singing along with the group, were the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, all part, as kids, I mean we're talking teenagers, as part of this early scene, the age of 18, 19 years old, that kind of thing, somehow getting into these clubs. It's out of that scene that the first version of the Rolling Stones emerges, and that's what we'll talk about in the next video, the early Stones.